There we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to, or wherever you are in the world, might not be morning. Good morning or good day to you. Welcome to Ishtar Fest, the second day. Today we have, or right now we have with us Edward VanDerJagt. Did I get that right?
Yep.
He's a second generation Sumerian reconstructionist and father of a third. He's the author of the annotated illustrated Descent of Inanna, which I believe we have in the Hands of Change library, and the creator of the Sumerian Oracle deck, which if you go to his bio page, there are links to both of those. He's perhaps best known as the founder of the Temple of Sumer, one of the oldest and longest running Mesopotamian pagan organizations, acting as a hub for members of Mesopotamian temples and where they Mesopotamian temples and traditions can meet. Welcome, Ed. Turn it over to you.
All right, so let me see if I can change the setting. And I have no idea how to do that. Give me just a sec. All right, well, it doesn't matter. Trying to full screen my face so I could see what I'm doing. Anyway, so a lot of you have seen my Descent of Inanna book. Some of you have probably seen the Sumerian Oracle deck, and it's not a tarot deck. It doesn't have the same tarot associations. It's got 84 cards so that I could work in some Sumerian numerology, and so I could balance all 7 of the 7 gods who decree fate. However, for those who are familiar with tarot, you'll be familiar with roughly how it works. And the reason I'm telling you a lot about that is because I'm going to be using the pictures on the cards as sort of my props. Oh, and I'm also the author of a comic book. It's before I learned how to draw, so you'll have to forgive me. But I used it to teach the basics of Sumerian theology. Anyway, the Oracle deck was created with as close as I could work at the iconography from ancient Mesopotamia. So we have cylinder seal images, we have images from the temples. Some I had to base upon the descriptions in the texts, and I did my level best to keep the style simple so that people can replicate it later. All right, so the god that you're probably all familiar with is Inanna, otherwise known as Ishtar. The reason for 2 different names is because we have 2 different languages we're working with. Although Ishtar actually has some Sumerian roots, but nothing right. All the gods tend to have an Akkadian name and a Sumerian name. Same religion, different languages. They were kind of like the US and Mexico, in that you have a lot of similarities in the culture, but 2 different languages. Anyway, so we'll start off with Enlil. Enlil is the king of the gods. He is the god of wind. He is not the earliest ancestor of the gods. So you would think that the leader of the gods would be the father of all of the deities, but that's not the case. His father, An, who is also father of Enki, would be the ancestor of the gods. And he's who I am going to go with next. Now, we don't have any definitive images of Enlil or An in the archaeological record. Usually they are represented, that's a word. Usually they are represented by symbols like a crown or a star. The Sumerian star is kind of this asterisk-like symbol, which you can see at the bottom here. That symbol is the symbol of divinity. And An is, as the father of the pantheon, his symbol is that symbol. So he represents all of the gods in that respect. An is the god of the upper heavens. So the stars and the cosmos, whereas Enlil is the god of the lower heaven, the wind, storms, the air, etc. Now, occasionally you'll see somebody saying that Enki and Enlil, the rival story was so that they could spin the narrative that all the pantheons are the same pantheon, and it was kind of an outdated way of thinking. Enki is Enlil's greatest supporter. When Enlil decided that he wanted the gods organized to promote civilization, he asked Enki to come up with the system to organize all the gods. So if you think of a modern science fiction, if you've got the gung-ho leader type, that would be Enlil. If you've got the clever scientist who's always coming up with interesting ways to support him, that would be Enki. Enki is the god of wisdom. He's the god of magic. He's the god of fresh water. Next, we have Ninh Hersek. Now, she is the goddess of the foothills. She's the goddess of birth. She's the goddess of the farm. She's the goddess of cows. In fact, the omega symbol that is her symbol is actually a stylized set of horns for an older type of livestock in the area. And so if you picture an ox with the horns that go down and then curve, that's kind of the symbol omega. Now, she is the wife of Enki. And Enki also has another wife, Damkina. And before you say that's sexist, she also has another husband, who I will get to in a little bit if I manage to get that far. But I'm going to focus on the seven who decree fate first. The next is the moon god, Nana Suen. And the moon is the chief way you recognize time. So he is the Lord of time. not to be confused with Time Lords. Those are different. Anyway, he's the Lord of Time, and he is the wife of Ningal, the goddess of the reeds. A little romantic way you can think about it, the tide is thought to be the moon god caressing the cheek of the goddess of the reeds, because the reeds are in the water and the tide rises and falls across the reeds. Now, An is the father of the gods in general, and Enki and Enlil have many children themselves. But you might be more familiar with the children of Nana Suen, because his children include Inanna and Utu. And that brings me to Utu, god of the sun, god of law, one of the judges of the gods, god of merchants, god of travelers. So in the myth where Inanna descends to the underworld, it is actually, nope, I'm confusing myths here. In the myth where Gilgamesh's best friend / minister descends into the underworld, it is Utu, the god of the sun, who resurrects him. Now, for those of you only familiar with the Babylonian version, I will tell you, spoiler, that the story has a much happier ending for Enkidu in the original Sumerian version. It isn't just his ghost that's brought back. He is entirely brought back to life. And then they go on to another adventure after he comes back to life. Now, a deity that you might all be familiar with, Inanna. Now, interestingly, you'll have a lot of people tell you that Inanna is the most commonly depicted deity. That might not actually be correct. A lot of the images that are attributed to be Inanna, we don't for certain know who they are. For example, you will see an image, the Burney relief. It's a nude figure. The wings are downswept. You've got the hands up holding rod and ring. The figure has bird-like feet and is standing on a lion. There are owls to the sides, but those are later additions. So we don't actually know that that's Inanna. The lions that she's standing on suggest maybe that it is Inanna, but we have similar images from that time period where the figure is standing on other animals or is positioned without any animals around them at all, suggesting that the lions are not actually crucial to the image. The bird feet are often associated with the underworld, and so that means to a lot of people that says, oh, well, Inanna descended into the underworld. Yes, but so did Enlil. Areshkogal lives in the underworld. There are other female deities in the underworld. So we don't actually know who that figure is. And that figure is the one that we see very commonly represented. Now, if you've got an image in your house and you've been calling that image Inanna for a long time, there is good news. We have evidence that in the ancient times, what they would do is they'd make a general figure that could be customized to represent whichever deity in your house you would worship. So variations of that image were actually mass produced. We have a mold that they used to create those images. So that means that if you've been using that image to represent Inanna, and that image is a generic image that could represent any deity, congratulations, now it's Inanna. All right, so Inanna is think of her as the goddess of passionate emotions. She's often described as the goddess of love and war, but that's more of an oversimplification. She's the goddess of doing everything with your entire being. She doesn't do anything by half measures. When Inanna gets angry, she gets very angry. When Inanna gets upset, she gets very upset. So those are the 7 deities who decree fate. Any questions?
We don't have questions yet, but I was thinking that what you were saying about the symbols representing the deities is very similar to the pre-Mosaic Iron Age Judaism, where they had like a block of wood, a Shara, to represent the goddess of a Shara.
Yeah, actually, it's probably where it came from. There are a lot of links between early Judaism and Mesopotamian religion, early Greek religion and Mesopotamian religion, Canaanite, a little bit of Zoroastrian, less Zoroastrian than you'd think, but considering they were very, very close neighbors. And there's actually evidence that some Sumerian thought would have ended up a lot further east in India, because we know that the Sumerians started trading with the Indus Valley, and we've got some genetic comparisons with the Mesopotamians and the Dravidians. A Dravidian is a language family in India. There's actually some loanwords from Sumerian in early Dravidian text, but that's not my area, so you'd have to contact an expert there. But from Mesopotamia, you have this flowering of ideas that spread throughout the ancient world. All right, let's move on, unless there's any other questions. All right, let's move on to the gods of the underworld. Now, chief among those gods, absolute ruler of the underworld, is Areshkogal. Now, Areshkogal is said to be taken by Kur as a wife. This is kind of a representation of how the ancient priesthood worked. So you'd have a priest or priestess essentially marry the deity of the temple. And so by marrying the underworld, Areshkogal became the ruler of the underworld. Now, Areshkogal is considered one of the most beautiful of the deities. She is sought after by obviously the underworld itself, and she's sought after by the Bull of Heaven, and she's sought after by the god Nergal. So she does not have the most wealthy of kingdoms. So occasionally you'll see in texts like Gilgamesh where nope, I've flipped it again. In texts like the Descent of Inanna, where a figure comes back from the underworld and they have to have somebody take their place. This is because the underworld doesn't want to give up any wealth. Kind of a different idea than you have in Greece with their underworld, where Pluto is the god of wealth. Now, just because the underworld is not the wealthiest of realms doesn't make it absolutely powerless. When Inanna went to the underworld, she went to the gate and she threatened to pull down the gate and have the dead overwhelm the living. And so this implies that the underworld is a powerful realm. Let me give you a little geography of the underworld first. Believe it or not, we know a lot about what all's in the underworld. We have, compared to, say, Norse religion, we have far more information about Kur than we do about Valhalla. So you die and are buried. Your grave provides a gateway for your shadow to go to the underworld. And there are three parts of your soul: the shadow, the breath, and the water. As you die, your breath escapes, presumably goes to the lower heavens where Enlil, god of wind, resides. Your shadow goes to the underworld. Through the grave, they get to the gatehouse. The gatehouse is Ganser. And traditionally, they would pay a toll to the gatekeeper. This toll would be more of an offering, so it didn't necessarily need to be a set amount, but the more you offer, the more that it represents your own power in life. Moving from there, in the journey of Ninh Hersek to the underworld, we see a kind of a wasteland before you get to the great city of Urukgal. Now, Urukgal is this vast singular city in the underworld. It's probably not the only thing, not the only place in the underworld you can go, but it's definitely the capital of the underworld. And at the center of that is Areshkogal's home. And there is a garden in that home. There's a great feasting table in that home. And you want to be close to Areshkogal in the underworld. So what decides where you go? This is before the idea of inherent good and evil. So it's not the good people go here and the bad people go this other place. No, it's the ones who were the most useful to society. So it's sort of a meritocracy that gets you close to the center. And she also gives favor to those who had some amount of misfortune in life. Stillborn children, children who died very young, she takes special care of those. So Areshkogal, even as the all-powerful deity of the underworld, is very compassionate. Now, I should actually mention there's a few other places in the underworld. If you violate the order of the universe, break the laws of the gods, you can be sent to this sort of pit as punishment. It's kind of think of it as sort of a jail. There's no evidence that you were eternally sent there, and there's no evidence that it was inherently a place of torture, but it's not a place you'd want to go. You also have the island on the Sea of Life and Death, which means that there's also a Sea of Life and Death. And to get to that sea from the world of the living, you follow a river path, and the river's name is the Man-Eating River. So that's not ominous at all. So the Enki went down through this river path when he placed Areshkogal on the top of the throne for the underworld. All right. More deities of the underworld.
Jason, we do have a question if you want me to read it to you.
Go ahead.
It's from Chelsea, and it says, would opening the gates so the dead overwhelm the living be a zombie apocalypse?
Actually, it's been described as that a lot of times. Zombies actually come from a much later group of religions. So zombie comes from the Loa Baron Samade. So we're talking thousands and thousands of years later. So you can see the similarity between zombie and Samade in the way the words sound. And the idea is that this Bokor, this kind of evil witch, and I believe they're generally male, would blow a powder into your face, which is actually a real thing. And it would suspend your ability to make judgment calls. So you'll do basically anything that you're told to do. And these were zombies. Modern Hollywood zombies actually come from an early vampire fiction where somebody thought, hey, if one vampire can bite somebody and turn them into a vampire, and then that person can bite somebody and turn them into a vampire, vampires could spread like a plague. And so they decided that they'd make this into a movie like 3 or 4 times. And they thought, maybe instead of having them be vampires, we'll have them be zombies. And that's how Hollywood zombies were born. Now, back to the original question. Would it be a zombie apocalypse? No, it would be a vampire apocalypse, because the early vampire myths, not from that exact word, but blood drinking undead, comes from Mesopotamia. And you actually have a variety of different types of vampires that come from Mesopotamia. In one text, we have the god Nergal, and a few others are mentioned, but he's the one I'm most familiar with, is mentioned as drinking the blood of the living. You have the Gala Demons, which are kind of the police of the underworld, and they are said to drink blood. The shadows, that part of the soul that becomes the ghost, they can also drink blood. Let's see, we've got the Mashkimu, or Maskim, depending on your preferred pronunciation. Mashkimu is more accurate, but pronunciation is kind of this vague thing with dead languages. So for a lot of people, the early translation, Maskim, is a little bit more familiar. They are the kind of greater not judges, kind of like they would be in charge of the Gala. They would make sure that the demons of the underworld keep law and order. And they don't break the rules, because they will occasionally break the rules. Anyway, you've got a number of these different figures from the underworld, but blood drinking and the underworld are very closely connected. There's actually, I was reading the Udog Hull text. It's a exorcistic text, and there is a form of what you might think of as a vampire. You've got a shadow that wants to go to the underworld, because the underworld is where the shadows are supposed to be. And this shadow gets together with 6 other entities, and they attack a living person with the idea that that living person is going to get buried, and they are going to get sent to the underworld by kind of piggybacking along. But it goes wrong. So instead, they manage to kill him, but do not manage to render them dead. So the person that they have now has 7 demons inhabiting their dead body. And this would be another kind of extreme example of a vampire. There's a number of good books if you're interested in really old vampire, spirit, underworld lore, and that is The Underworld by Dina Katz. And let me grab that book real quick. It's a monster of a tome. All right. Helps if I have these things right side up. Okay, so The Image of the Netherworld by Dina Katz. She is the bar none expert on the underworld from the Sumerian sources. She doesn't, in this vast book, she doesn't cover any of the Akkadian sources. She just focuses on Sumerian sources. And even just focusing on the Sumerian sources, that book is huge. It's also a little expensive. But okay, moving on with other deities of the underworld. You've got Namtar. Now, his name means death, but it also means fate, because the fate of all living things is to eventually die. And he is the Grim Reaper figure of the underworld. He is the one that ends up being like in charge of all death. So Areshkogal, even as the goddess of the underworld, isn't actually responsible for people dying. That would be her son, Namtar. Now, presumably, Namtar's father is either Kur or the Bull of Heaven. It's not Nergal. We don't know exactly who the father is. I would lean towards the Bull of Heaven. The next son of Areshkogal would be Ninazir. Now, interestingly, he is a god of healing. So I've always seen him as the individual that heals the soul when that soul goes down to the underworld. Now, he in turn has an important son, the god Ningisida. Now, Ningisida is the god of dusk and dawn, god of the sunrise and the sunset, and he has connections to the Greek god with the catechus, the intertwined snakes.
We have a question.
Oh, sure.
If you,
go ahead.
Will, go ahead.
Okay, I was asking if the masculine or whatever it was are related to the Masochene in Jewish demonology.
Not that I know of. I mean, the name is definitely similar. So it's something I could look into. Yeah, I'm not familiar with any links. It would all depend on when the term in Jewish demonology was adopted. Because if it was one of the very early ones, then yes, there's a good chance. If the name was adopted later during, say, the 5th century BC or AD, then the chance is a lot less so. So I don't know about that one. That's a good question, though. And if any of you didn't hear that, the question was if the Masochene of Jewish demonology is related to the Mashkimu of Mesopotamian demonology. Not sure. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question directly, but that's all I've got.
That was helpful. Thank you. We kind of know what direction to look in now.
All right. Any other questions?
Melvin is asking if you can speak on Lamashtu some more.
Actually, I don't think I've gotten to Lamashtu.
Okay, sorry.
Let me. Oh, tell me that I didn't. So I've got these cards all in order for when I intended to speak on them. But okay, so Lamashtu is a goddess of insects, pests, death by infanticide, death of the mother. She is quite often condemned by the other deities because what she does, she doesn't do because that is her place. She does it because she is sadistic. And so she resides in the underworld. And it's pretty likely that she resides in the underworld, mostly because the underworld has that pit where she can be imprisoned. There are quite a lot of different texts that relate to her, but they're very vague because the texts we have are mostly spells that protect you against her, or they call on Pazuzu, who is her adversary. Pazuzu is scary looking, but his job is actually to protect mothers and children from Lamashtu. Let's see. Actually, that book I showed you earlier by Dina Katz has a pretty long section on Lamashtu. Another fantastic book that honestly everyone should have is a book that we in the Sumerian community just call Black and Green because the authors are named Black and Green. Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia. And that book is an alphabetized dictionary of everything you'd want to know about the Mesopotamian gods, the symbols, etc. So I highly recommend that book. Let's see. Next deity of the underworld, unless there's any more questions.
Yeah, there is.
Sure thing.
There's a question about a comment that Inanna made about Areshkogal, which I'm trying to find, unless one of the, either if Evergreen or Inanna could unmute and say the comment, that would also be fine.
Are you referring to death, like the causing of death?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, where you mentioned that she was not the bringer of death, but the protector.
Correct. At least to my knowledge, we don't have any texts or evidence that Areshkogal actually causes the death. However, she is more seen as this, if you want to say mother type figure, probably more like the stepmother type figure and protectress of the souls in the underworld. Which to me, it's not surprising that she is usually depicted with the head of a lioness, because she really is, to me, very fiercely protective of these souls and of her realm.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with the section that you're referring to, but everything you're saying is pretty accurate. So yes, Areshkogal is not the goddess of death, but the protector of the dead. Now, for a lot of underworlds, when you go down there, you're essentially trapped. Not so with the Mesopotamian underworld. So yes, the underworld is literally translated as the place of no return, but what it means is that you don't return to life. The ghosts will visit for a month-long period during the month of ghosts. It's kind of like, think of a month-long Halloween. And it's a little bit earlier in the season, but it's where you would have an extra setting at the table and the ghost would come by. Now, for those of you with Jewish backgrounds, that might sound familiar. Where a invisible person comes by and you've set up an extra setting at the table, and they enjoy a meal with you. So that's the Sumerian root of that particular tradition. It was a month-long celebration starting the morning after the full moon, and it, let's see if I remember right, it gets its height at the, morning after the new moon, not the morning after the full moon. And it gets its height at the full moon. So halfway through the month is the peak of this festival month. Anyway, any more questions?
Looks like we've caught up.
All right. Next deity.
And we have
is,
about 10 minutes left till noon, just to give you a time check.
I will kind of pick up the pace.
Pazuzu,
right. Next deity.
There's a question about Pazuzu and
All
Beth.
Right.
That is Bess, Egyptian Bess related to Pazuzu. I think that's what the question was.
Not to my knowledge, but Egyptian Bess, that's the dwarf, if I remember right, is definitely from Mesopotamian origin, which is why that figure doesn't look at all like the rest of the Egyptian deities. The figure might be related to Huwawa or Humbaba. He's not a figure I'm much of an expert on, so I can't really speak to the origins of him. I just know that he has Mesopotamian origins. All right, anyway. Neti, the gatekeeper. Now, kind of conveniently for the English language, Neti has a net that he uses to bind and then tie up individuals who try to break the gate of the underworld. And he's the chief gatekeeper. There are actually a few texts that have a lot of the other gatekeepers, but he is the one that is in charge of the gatehouse at Ganzer. Next, we have the Bull of Heaven. And the Bull of Heaven is, he's kind of a seasonal figure. He is said to die every year at I believe it was the spring storm season. And the thunder is him trampling on the tops of the clouds. He is, or was, the husband of Areshkogal. And for those of you who are familiar with Gilgamesh, he was slain when he was sent to Earth by Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which kind of sparked off all of the events of the descent of Inanna. Because when Inanna went to the underworld, the reason that she gave to go there was to act as the officiator of the Bull of Heaven's funeral. Which is why when Enki gave the 2 figures to allow Inanna to come back to life, those 2 figures were actually mourning figures. So they mourned on behalf of Areshkogal for her loss, which nowhere else in the myth cycle had anyone done. And so because of that compassion, she said, I will give you anything. And they demanded Inanna, or Inanna's corpse. The next is Nergal. Nergal is the god of war, disease, somewhat of a god of death. And later in mythology, Areshkogal took him as her husband. Now, there's a lot of debate on that particular text, and I don't think we really have time to go into that, but some people say that he was taken to be the ruler of the underworld. That is not actually the case. What he ended up being is put as one of the 4 governors of the underworld under Areshkogal. So Areshkogal still retained authority in the underworld, even after those 2 married. Next, we have Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is often thought of as a demigod and a king, but after death, he became one of the 4 governors of the underworld. There are other underworld deities, and since I've got like 5 minutes, I'm going to rush through the 4 hero gods. We have Shara, Gabil, Ishkur, and Nanerta. Shara is he's a warrior, he's a hero, but he's also the hairdresser of Inanna. Gabil is a more practical hero god, and he is the god of fire, forging, cooking. He purifies water. Of all the hero gods of the ancient world, he's probably the best to have around. Then you have Ishkur. Ishkur and Ninerta are both storm deities. Ishkur is specifically the god of lightning. So in the modern time, he's a pretty good one to have around because of all the electrical devices we have. And finally, we have Ninerta. Now, Ninerta is he's a warrior storm god, and he actually has a weapon that is also a god. So the weapon that Ninerta uses is a god in its own right, and has its own storm and wind-like powers. And that's probably all that I have really time to go through. there are a lot of deities. There's a lot of mythology that we have to work with. So I think I have time for maybe one question.
Yeah, there's a question. If you could say something about Gula Pau.
So Gula is the goddess of healing. And let's see, she's often she's a goddess of healing. She is a goddess of dogs. She's often depicted next to dog figures. Now she's one that we have a lot of images for because believe it or not, people got injured and sick in the ancient world. And so you'd want to go to her and to seek healing. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. And for a couple of people just joined us, we're giving Jason giving Ed a couple of more minutes so that because the next person's workshop is a little short, and they said it was fine if you wanted a few more minutes for them to start a couple of minutes late.
All right, well then I will tell you a fun story. So I mentioned way at the beginning that some of these female goddesses had two husbands. Now, most famously, Inanna had Dumuzi, but she also had the deity Zababa, who is a warrior deity from Kish. And so whereas Dumuzi was her husband in one part of Mesopotamia, Zababa would be her husband in another part of Mesopotamia. Now, Ninh Hersek had two husbands. Enki is one, but also there's this interesting deity, Shulpe. And so early translations of the text say he is the god of the bountiful table. He is a god of, he's got oxen and he's got an orchard. And so you're thinking, oh, he's a feasting god. No, he's the god of the table, not the stuff on the table, the table. He's a carpentry god. Oh yeah, he wields a mighty hammer because you need it to hammer the bits of the wood together. And what about the orchard? I mean, you know, you've got all that fruit. Well, yes, but the orchard is made of wood, which you need to build the table. I put it all together when I read one of his great epitaphs. He is, or one of his great accomplishments. He is let's see, it went like this. Ninh Hersek's altar was built by Shulpe himself. And I'm like, why is that significant for a god of the feast? Oh, he's the god of the table itself. And just the light went off on the top of my head. I'm like, that makes so much more sense. And I went back and read every little, because there isn't much on him. He doesn't have any myths. He's just mentioned here and there. So he is the other husband for Ninh Hersek. And you can kind of see what she might see in him. He is described as gleaming. This is because he's a very hard worker and he's muscular and covered in sweat. So just, I love this deity because of the kind of quirkiness of the translation. Like just finding out about him was just so interesting. Let's see. I already mentioned Zababa, and cut me off anytime that the next person is ready. Just feel free, because I will just go on for hours.
Okay. Well, I mean, they are on, but
all
they,
right.
so if you have like a wrap up or something like that, and we would love to, this has been great. I don't know if you've seen the chat, but there's a ton of love for you in the chat. Everyone's going, wow, this is so great. He's got to come back next year, you know, excellent presentations.
Well, yeah, I've really wanted to go to Ishtar Fest every year that I've heard it gone on. The first time we heard about it, I'm like, oh, we've got to invite these people to Temple of Sumer. This sounds like exactly the crowd that would get along with the crowd that we've already got. And I was right. You guys are awesome. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Before I go, let me say one more thing about the Sumerian Oracle deck. So one reason why it's kind of popular, I say that and none of you guys have heard of it, is because it's really, really easy to use. So the cards, you've got the images on the front, but on the back, you've got the interpretations. So I understood when I made it that not everyone is going to be familiar with all of the deities and all of the spirits and all of the aspects that relate to Mesopotamia. So I put the aspects on the back, and so that it would make it very easy for a new person to just pick it up and use. And one of the major differences between the Sumerian Oracle and traditional tarot is the use of an orator card. So every time that you have a reading, instead of having the reading come from the quote unquote the spirits, you know exactly who it's coming from. So is the message coming from the god Shulpe? Is the message coming from the spirit of the temple? It'll tell you. If the card is inverted, though, it's somebody that's similar, but might not even be Mesopotamian. So Shulpe, if he comes up in your reading as the orator, right side up, you're getting the message from Shulpe. If the card is inverted, it's from some other god, perhaps a crafting god of, I don't know, Greece or Egypt. And so you get a very rich reading once you know the perspective of the person that's speaking to you. So a reading with Shulpe might focus a lot on your own personal crafting things, because you're going to get different advice going to different people. You're going to get different advice going to different gods. And so that's one of the very unique things about the deck.
How did you, I'll see if there's any last questions, that I don't see any, but feel free to raise your hand. How did you decide which deities to include in the deck? Because there's so many of them.
Well, let's see. I did kind of, I went for each of the 7 who decree fate, all of the major underworld deities. And you'll notice in the corners, there's a little symbol. So, and there we go. So we see a little omega symbol. and I grouped them by the 7 degree who decree fate. So a god closely associated with Ninh Hersek would be in the suit of Ninh Hersek, whereas a goddess or a god who was associated with, say, Enki or Inanna would have theirs. And all of the deity cards have a black border and all of the non-deity cards have a gray border. How I decided which ones not to put in, I didn't put in ones that weren't necessarily Mesopotamian. Like a lot of people associate Tiamat as a major Sumerian deity. She only shows up in one myth, and we have no idea if she has any roots before that myth. And she doesn't show up other than like a couple brief mentions after that myth. And the Babylonian creation epic is heavily foreign influenced and heavily politicized. So Tiamat is not in the deck, but Marduk is in the deck because we do know where he comes from. We do know that he is the son of Enki. He was a grain deity before he was the god of Babylon. Well, I mean, he was the god of Babylon all the time, but he started out as a grain deity.
Okay.
right.
Chelsea wins the last question honor. So go ahead, Chelsea.
Without meaning in the least bit to be facetious, I'd like to hear Ed talk just a little bit about how Pazuzu went from a more or less positive figure to being the demon from The Exorcist.
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so he is scary looking. You see Pazuzu and you see his claw upraised, and you see the lion head, and a couple of images have him with the wings. He's scary looking. If you're gonna have a scary monster for a movie, he is a great choice. They didn't really go with that, but if you know nothing about what he actually does, and you're just looking at images, then that's a great place to start. Modern images of him even have him with a snake penis. So that's not ancient, by the way. If you look at ancient images, you'll never see the actual snake or hear any mention of that snake. But it's great if you're trying to scare your audience. And that's actually kind of his place in mythology. He didn't protect people by being the nicest guy. He protected people by being scarier than all of the bad things.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ed. That was a great ending, and I kind of bringing us back to modern times. So we get a little moment to reorient ourselves from the far distant past. I know I really enjoyed this. I loved watching all the comments. It was a very active group of people, and I've saved the comments, so if you're interested, I can give you a copy of them.
I'd love to see that, yeah.
Or you can save them on your own computer, either way. So if people are interested, they should get in touch with you through Temple of Sumer on Facebook. Is that a good way to?
Yeah, that's a great way to get a hold of me. Temple of Sumer talks generally about Mesopotamian stuff. If you are a Portuguese speaker, there's also another group that is a temple in Portugal. There is Temple of Inanna, which I'm not actually a member of, which focuses a lot on Inanna, and Temple of Enki, which focuses on more spirituality and magic aspects.
Excellent. So we are so grateful that you shared all this knowledge with us. Thank you so much for staying on a few more minutes and sharing a little bit more. I know I learned stuff. I hope everybody learned a lot. I see a lot of heads nodding, and
You have a new young fan here, Ed.
Hi.
He took notes of everything you said.
Cool.
I'm going to stop.
How old is she?